The air was thick, with the acrid scent of alien oils burning in the torches that lined the execution platform. The crowd of Krevlorians gathered below, their reptilian throats vibrating in anticipation, their eyes gleaming under the crimson moons. The execution square, once a place of human governance on this occupied colony, had been desecrated into a public stage for humiliation and death. Commander Nathan Hale's wrists ached from the tight iron manacles cutting into his skin. He stood among his men, their bodies bruised and battered, clad in torn remnants of their uniforms. His soldiers, brothers in arms, kept their heads high despite the agony of their impending fate. The nooses swayed above them like the hands of a clock counting down to their final breath. A Krevlorian overseer, his scaled face twisted in what might have passed for amusement, stepped forward and spread his arms. His armored frame towered over the humans, his voice booming across the square. People of the Empire, behold the fate of those who resist. The last remnants of Earth's defiance stand before you, broken and weak. Let this serve as a lesson to all who dream of rebellion. Hale clenched his jaw, his muscles tight with fury. Weak. If only they knew the truth of human resilience. His gaze swept over his fellow prisoners, locking eyes with Captain Elias Vaughn, who stood to his left. Vaughn's face was swollen from interrogation, but his eyes still burned with fire. Overlord Vrykor stepped onto the platform. The crowd fell into reverent silence. Draped in an obsidian cloak woven with golden threads, the Overlord's presence exuded control, his very posture a declaration of dominance. He studied the condemned, his gaze lingering on Hale. "You have fought well, Commander," Vrykor said, his tone almost conversational. "Humanity has always been persistent. But you must understand, resistance is futile. This war is already over." Hale's throat was dry, but he forced out a response. "Wars don't end until every last soldier falls. And we're still standing." The crowd erupted in guttural laughter, but Vrykor's smirk barely faltered. Brave words. But words do not halt the inevitable. He motioned to the executioners, hulking, four-armed brutes that positioned themselves behind the condemned, adjusting the ropes. Hale inhaled sharply as the coarse fiber pressed against his throat. He thought of Earth, of the millions still fighting, of the ones who had already died. The noose tightened. Then a sound, distant but sharp. A high-pitched whine, growing in intensity. A flicker of movement in the distant buildings. Hale barely had time to react before the sky split open with fire. Explosions erupted from the perimeter towers, sending shock waves through the square. The crowd screamed as debris rained down. Chaos surged like a tidal wave as the once orderly execution turned into a battlefield. A streak of light shot across the platform, striking one of the executioners in the chest. The brute let out a strangled cry before collapsing, his body convulsing as plasma fire seared through his flesh. Gunfire crackled in the distance. Hale jerked his body sideways, twisting against the rope. Vaughn was already moving, using the distraction to ram his elbow into the gut of a Krevlorian guard. The soldiers, those who could still move, fought with whatever strength they had left. The noose around Hale's neck loosened as a blade sliced through the rope from behind. He gasped as he fell forward, coughing and clutching at his throat. A firm hand grabbed his arm, yanking him to his feet. "Time to go," Vaughn barked, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Hale's instincts kicked in. He tore the manacles from his wrists, ignoring the raw skin beneath, and spun toward the battlefield that had once been their death stage. Human insurgents flooded the square, their weapons blazing as they cut through the disoriented Krevlorians. He grabbed a fallen rifle from a nearby corpse and pulled Vaughn behind cover as enemy reinforcements stormed in. "Who the hell organized this?" Hale shouted. Vaughn smirked as he fired off a round. "You think I spent my time rotting in a cell without making plans? Had a few favors to cash in." The insurgents were holding their ground, but the Krevlorians were adapting quickly, regaining formation. Across the plaza, Overlord Vrykor stood atop the platform, watching, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the chaos. Hale gritted his teeth. They would deal with him later. For now, survival was the priority. They pressed forward, cutting a path through the enemy ranks. The scent of scorched flesh and burning metal filled the air. The screams of the dying mixed with the battle cries of those who refused to fall. An explosion rocked the ground behind them, sending Hale and Vaughn sprawling. Dust and smoke clouded their vision. Hale, Vaughn. A voice crackled through the comms, distorted but familiar. We've got a transport waiting 3 blocks north. Move. Hale recognized the voice. General Adrian Calloway. That meant Earth's forces were still active, still fighting. He nodded to Vaughn, who grinned despite the blood trickling down his face. Time to leave. They sprinted through the wreckage, dodging enemy fire. The city around them was crumbling, the symbols of Krevlorian dominance reduced to smoldering ruins. The people who had been forced to kneel now rose in defiance, emboldened by the battle. They reached the transport, a battered but functional drop ship, its engines roaring as it hovered inches above the cracked pavement. Insurgents covered their retreat, laying down suppressive fire as they clambered aboard. As the ship ascended, Hale looked down at the execution platform, now engulfed in flames. His fingers tightened around his rifle. This wasn't just an escape. This was a declaration. No more diplomacy. No more surrender. The Krevlorians had drawn first blood. Now, humanity would answer. The War Council chamber was dimly lit, its walls lined with holographic displays flashing urgent reports from the outer colonies. Earth's military command had assembled in the underground fortress beneath the Arctic ice, the last bastion of humanity's resistance. The room was tense, a pressure cooker of barely restrained fury and calculated strategy. Commander Nathan Hale stood near the central table, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the holomap hovering before them. Red indicators marked the systems where the Krevlorians had massacred human prisoners, each symbol a silent testament to lives lost. A hand-shaped bruise still darkened his throat from the noose, a reminder of how close he had come to death. General Adrian Calloway surveyed the room, his broad shoulders squared, eyes sharp beneath his graying temples. The executions were a message, he said, voice steady but brimming with controlled anger. Vrykor wanted us to see humanity broken. Instead, he's given us our answer. Admiral Victor Steele, an older man with a face carved by decades of war, leaned forward. Our fleet is outnumbered 5-1. If we launch a direct assault, they'll sweat us out of the sky before we breach orbit. Hale exhaled sharply. He had expected resistance, but not hesitation. We don't need a direct assault. We need to gut them from the inside. He motioned toward the glowing red cluster marking Gamma V, a Krevlorian war factory planet. Their supply chains keep their fleets running. Their infrastructure feeds their troops. If we target their production hubs, we choke them at the source. Vaughn, standing at Hale's side, nodded. Hit them where they don't expect it. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage. We bleed them out instead of taking the brunt of their firepower. Calloway studied them both, then turned to Steele. You've fought 3 wars against superior numbers. Thoughts? Steele's lips thinned as he scrutinized the map. It's a damn good strategy, but it requires precision. One slip, and we're all dead. He glanced at Hale. You think you can pull it off? Hale met his gaze without hesitation. I know we can. Calloway nodded. Then you leave tonight. Get in crippled Gamma V and get out. We'll coordinate with other resistance cells for simultaneous strikes across Krevlorian health systems. Vaughn smirked. Hell of a first punch. Calloway's expression was grim. Make sure it lands. The dropship's interior was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the engines. Hale adjusted the straps of his tactical vest, checking his weapon for the 3rd time. Opposite him, Vaughn and Lieutenant Marcus West secured their gear. West was younger, sharp-eyed, his jaw clenched in determination. The ship jolted as it entered Gamma V's atmosphere. Through the viewport, the factory complex sprawled across the surface like a metallic infection, its foundries belching black smoke into the sky. Krevlorians moved below, oblivious to the predators descending upon them. The pilot's voice crackled in their earpieces. Landing in 60. Get ready. Hale met his team's eyes. No mistakes. We disable their defenses, plant the charges, and get out. Quick and clean. Vaughn grinned. You always say that. Hale smirked. And we're still here, aren't we? The drop ship touched down in the shadow of an abandoned storage facility. They moved fast, their boots soundless on the metal floor. The air was thick with the scent of molten steel and burning fuel. Navigating the industrial maze, they avoided patrols, slipping through dark corridors until they reached the power core chamber. The heart of the facility pulsed with energy, its control consoles glowing with alien symbols. West crouched by the main terminal, plugging in a hacking device. Give me 60 seconds. Hale covered the entrance, gripping his rifle. Sweat beaded at his temple as the seconds crawled by. Then the alarm screamed. West cursed. They've got countermeasures. Almost there. A plasma bolt sizzled past, striking the wall inches from his head. The room exploded into chaos as Krevlorian guards stormed in. Hale fired, dropping the first soldier before rolling behind cover. Vaughn's rifle barked beside him, each shot precise and deadly. West gritted his teeth, fingers flying over the device. 10 more seconds. A hulking Krevlorian officer charged, wielding an electrified blade. Hale barely dodged as the blade slashed through the air, sending sparks flying. He countered with a burst of fire to the alien's chest, but the creature snarled, still standing. Vaughn tackled it from behind, driving a combat knife into its exposed neck. The alien gurgled, collapsing in a heap. West shouted, "Done." The facility shuddered as the core overloaded. Emergency sirens wailed, red warning lights flashing. Hale grabbed West's vest and hauled him up. Move. They sprinted through the corridors as explosions tore through the factory. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A massive blast sent Hale sprawling, pain lancing through his ribs. Vaughn yanked him up. The exit was in sight. The ship loomed ahead, ramp extended, engines roaring. They raced for it as the factory collapsed behind them. The moment they hit the deck, the ship rocketed into the sky. Hale collapsed against the hull, panting. Vaughn laughed breathlessly beside him. That was clean. Hale coughed. Cleaner than last time. West grinned, his face smeared with soot. We just crippled their weapons production. Hale stared at the burning planet below. And that's just the beginning. The celebrations were muted, laced with grief. The Resistance's attacks had been a success, but retaliation was swift. Reports flooded in, entire human settlements annihilated. Families slaughtered in response to their defiance. Hale stood before the War Council once more, his hands clenched into fists. They're lashing out because they know they're vulnerable. Calloway's expression was grim. They massacred millions. Steele's jaw tightened. We knew the risk. Hale exhaled sharply, staring at the map of occupied space. This won't stop until we cut off the head. Vaughn crossed his arms. You're thinking about Vrykor. Hale met his gaze. I'm thinking about Krevloria Prime. Calloway's brows furrowed. You're suggesting an assassination. Steele shook his head. Impossible. Their homeworld is impenetrable. Hale's voice was steady. Nothing is impenetrable. Silence hung in the air. Then Calloway spoke. If we do this, there's no going back. Hale's eyes burned with conviction. There never was. The transport shuddered violently as it emerged from the abyss of slipspace, its hull groaning against the sheer gravitational pull of Krevloria Prime. Through the viewport, the homeworld of the enemy loomed like a jagged black pearl, its surface a maze of towering spires and subterranean networks, its skies clogged with military patrols. This was the heart of the Empire, a fortress world designed to repel any invasion before it even reached orbit. And yet, here they were, threading the needle between death and destiny. Commander Nathan Hale adjusted the stolen Krevlorian combat harness strapped across his chest. It felt unnatural, the weight of alien metal pressing against his ribs, but the disguise was necessary. The ruse had worked so far. Their stolen vessel had passed the first checkpoint. Now came the real test. Across from him, Captain Elias Vaughn sat rigidly, his normally sharp features hardened with unease. The dim green light of the cabin cast deep shadows across his face. His jaw clenched as he checked the pulse blaster hidden beneath his cloak. Beside him, Sergeant Theo Drake and Lieutenant Marcus West mirrored his tension. West was quieter than usual, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against his thigh. The youngest of them, but no less dangerous. Drake, in contrast, looked almost too calm, his scarred hands wrapped around the hilt of a concealed combat knife. A lifetime of warfare had made him unshakable, but even he knew the stakes were unlike any before. The ship's comm unit crackled, a guttural Krevlorian voice snarling through the static. Vessel 721, proceed to landing Bay Epsilon. Prepare for inspection. Any deviation will result in immediate destruction. Hale exhaled slowly. They were committed now. There was no turning back. Their pilot, a rogue Krevlorian defector named Jorvek, responded in the Empire's native tongue, his voice flawlessly mimicking the clipped authority of an officer. Acknowledged. Landing now. Maintain priority clearance. The transport banked sharply, descending toward the cityscape of Drazkuan, the imperial capital. A sprawling colossus of onyx structures and crimson banners, its streets teemed with the Empire's elite. Massive war machines crawled along the roads, flanked by patrols of Krevlorian enforcers. Above them, dreadnoughts hovered like storm clouds, their cannons poised to obliterate any threat before it even surfaced. As the ship touched down in the landing bay, the tension inside the cabin turned suffocating. Jorvek turned to them. "This is where we separate. I'll keep the ship prepped for extraction. You have 24 hours before they realize something is off. After that, you're on your own." Hale clasped his shoulder briefly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Jorvek gave a sharp nod before slipping into the shadows of the ship. The ramp lowered. The air that rushed in was thick with metallic dust and the biting scent of ozone. Hale led the team down, their stolen uniforms stiff against their movements. The first checkpoint was ahead, a cluster of Krevlorians stationed beneath a surveillance archway, their black eyes gleaming with suspicion. As they approached, one of the guards stepped forward, scanning them with an embedded ocular device. Hale kept his breathing steady. One wrong move, and they would die before they even made it past the doors. The device beeped. The guard grunted and waved them through. They walked in silence, each step measured, each breath a calculated risk. The corridor beyond led them into the underbelly of the city, a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels and transport rails. Their intel was clear. Vrykor's citadel lay at the city's core, buried beneath layers of defense systems. The only way in was through Sector 13, a slum forgotten by the Empire, where the dregs of Krevloria festered in the shadows. As they entered the sector, the air thickened with the stench of rot and decay. Dilapidated structures slouched against one another, their walls etched with symbols of dissent. Disfigured veterans, scavengers, and exiles lurked in the alleys, their eyes hollow, their bodies wrapped in tattered rags. A group of them watched as the humans passed, some with curiosity, others with something darker. A hunched figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into their path. His scales were faded, his body wrapped in an old Krevlorian officer's cloak, its insignia slashed. A traitor once, and now a ghost of his former self. "You are either desperate," he rasped, "or very, very foolish." Hale held his gaze. "We're both." The figure chuckled. "Then you will fit right in." His name was Korshik, a former strategist of the Krevlorians who had been cast out for questioning the Empire's methods. He had seen the cruelty firsthand. He had seen what became a species who resisted. And, more than anything, he wanted revenge. He led them deeper into the underbelly, through corridors littered with the remnants of forgotten lives. "The Citadel is impenetrable from the surface," Korshik explained. "But beneath it runs the vein network, a series of tunnels that supply power and resources to the city. Few know about them. Even fewer survived the journey. They followed him to a concealed grate beneath a ruined structure. The tunnel beyond was dark, pulsing with the rhythmic hum of machinery. Hale looked at his team. No turning back. Vaughn smirked. Wasn't planning on it. They climbed inside. The descent was long, the air growing hotter, thick with the scent of fuel and damp metal. The tunnel walls were lined with glowing conduits, their alien symbols flickering with unreadable messages. They moved in silence, each footstep a whisper against the cold steel. Then a sound ahead, a chittering, wet and unnatural. Hale raised his fist, signaling a stop. From the darkness, a shape lunged. It hit West first, knocking him to the ground with a snarl. A Krevlorian war beast, its body a mass of sinewy muscle and armored plating, its maw lined with razor teeth. West barely managed to get his rifle up before the creature sank its claws into his shoulder. Drake was on it in an instant, knife flashing as he drove it into the beast's neck. It howled, thrashing wildly, but Hale put 2 rounds in its skull, dropping it instantly. West groaned, gripping his bleeding shoulder. "That's one hell of a guard dog." Korshik looked grim. "There will be more." They moved faster. When they finally reached the core of the tunnels, they stood before a massive security gate, its doors etched with Krevlorian script. Beyond it was the throne chamber of Overlord Vrykor. Korshik worked at the control panel, his claws moving deftly. "Once I open this, there is no turning back." Hale chambered a round into his rifle. "We never planned to." The doors groaned, metal grinding against metal as they slid open. The citadel lay beyond, a cathedral of shadows and power. And at its center, waiting like a beast in the dark, was their enemy. Hale stepped forward, pulse steady. The final battle had begun. The throne chamber stretched before them, a vast and cavernous expanse carved from obsidian stone, its jagged walls pulsing with an eerie crimson glow. The air crackled with energy, thick with the scent of scorched metal and something older, something ancient. At the center of it all sat Overlord Vrykor. The Krevlorians had built this place as a temple to their conquests, a monument to their dominance. Banners of flayed enemy standards hung like trophies along the towering pillars. But it was not the relics of past victories that held Hale's attention. It was the Overlord himself. Vrykor stood as they entered, his massive form uncoiling from the throne like a serpent disturbed from slumber. His armored exoskeleton gleamed under the low light, the deep scars across its surface telling the story of countless battles. His obsidian crown curved like the horns of some long-dead beast, casting sharp shadows across his reptilian features. "So," Vrykor rumbled, his voice like distant thunder, "the insects have crawled into the maw of the beast." Hale tightened his grip on his rifle. Every instinct screamed that they shouldn't be here, that this was madness. But there was no turning back. "We're not insects," Hale said. His voice was steady, with a fire that burns empires to the ground. Vrykor laughed, a sound both guttural and mocking. "Fire? No, human. You are merely embers, flickering before the inevitable cold." His black eyes gleamed as he stepped forward. "Did you truly believe you could walk into my domain and live?" The doors behind them slammed shut. The trap had been sprung. From the shadows, Krevlorian honor guards emerged, their forms draped in ceremonial war armor, plasma blades humming to life in their four-fingered hands. Each one was a veteran, a killer forged in the fires of 1,000 battlefields. Vaughn cursed under his breath. This was too easy. Should have known. Hale didn't waste words. "We fight." Then all hell broke loose. The honor guards lunged, their plasma blades slicing through the air. Hale ducked the first strike, his rifle barking as he sent a round through an approaching warrior's skull. Beside him, Vaughn moved like a phantom, his sidearm flashing as he landed 3 precise shots in quick succession. West parried a blade with his combat knife, the force of the impact sending a jolt up his arm. He twisted, driving the blade into the alien's side before rolling away from a second attacker. Drake went straight for the kill, meeting one of the guards in brutal hand-to-hand combat. His blade found a gap in the armor, slicing through thick flesh. The alien howled, staggering backward before Drake silenced it with a second strike to the throat. The battle raged, but it was Vrykor who commanded the space, watching them with cold calculation. Then he moved. The Overlord was a force of nature, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Hale barely had time to react before Vrykor's massive fist slammed into his chest, sending him flying across the chamber. His back crashed against the stone floor, the impact rattling his bones. He gasped, struggling to rise, but Vrykor was already there. The Overlord's massive foot pressed against Hale's chest, pinning him in place. "I have crushed armies," he snarled. "You are but a footnote in history." Hale gritted his teeth. His ribs felt like they were on fire, but he refused to yield. Vaughn sprinted forward, firing point-blank at Vrykor's head, but the Overlord snatched the weapon mid-shot, the plasma bolts searing harmlessly off his armor. With a single movement, he ripped the gun from Vaughn's hand and threw him aside like a ragdoll. Drake and West charged together, blades flashing, but Vrykor caught West by the throat, lifting him effortlessly into the air. West struggled, clawing at the Overlord's grip, but Vrykor only squeezed tighter. "Your species' arrogance is your undoing," he growled. "Did you think I did not anticipate this?" Hale's vision blurred. His fingers curled around the hilt of his combat knife. The Overlord's attention was split. This was his moment. With a roar of defiance, Hale drove the blade into Vrykor's exposed leg, right between the armor plating. The Overlord bellowed in pain, his grip on West loosening just enough for West to twist free. Vaughn retrieved his fallen rifle, flipping the setting to high charge. "Hale, move." Hale rolled to the side just as Vaughn fired. The energy bolt struck Vrykor square in the chest, staggering him. But the Overlord did not fall. Instead, he laughed. "You do not understand," he growled, straightening. "This is not just my throne. It is my ascension." The room trembled. The walls pulsed with power. And then Hale saw it. The chamber itself was a living conduit, siphoning energy from the city, from the entire planet. Vrykor was drawing strength from the world beneath his feet. They couldn't kill him here. Not like this. Hale's mind raced. They needed to sever his connection. He glanced at the primary power conduits, thick cables running from the throne into the walls. That was the key. "West, Drake, cut those lines," Hale ordered, dodging another devastating strike from the Overlord. West and Drake moved instantly, slashing at the conduits. Sparks erupted, the chamber's red glow flickering violently. Vrykor's expression darkened. No, the momentary lapse in his focus was all Hale needed. He surged forward, grabbing Vrykor's own plasma blade from a fallen guard. The Overlord turned just as Hale drove the weapon through his chest. The blade sank deep, piercing flesh and bone, impaling Vrykor against his own throne. The Overlord stared at him, disbelief flickering in his black eyes. "You," his voice faltered. "You will not win." Hale's grip tightened. "We already have." With a final twist of the blade, he ripped it free. Vrykor slumped, his massive frame collapsing onto the throne as the power around him failed. The citadel shook. West shouted, "We have to go." Alarms blared as the power destabilized. The throne room began to collapse, chunks of stone falling from above. Hale didn't look back. They ran, weaving through crumbling corridors, explosions shaking the city beneath them. Jorvek was waiting at the extraction point, the stolen transport's engines already roaring. "Get in." They leapt aboard just as the platform behind them gave way, plummeting into the abyss. The ship shot into the sky, the city erupting in flames below. As they broke through the planet's atmosphere, Hale stared at the burning capital, the seat of the Empire crumbling into ruin. He exhaled, exhaustion settling into his bones. Vaughn clapped a hand on his shoulder, grinning despite the blood staining his face. Hell of a way to win a war. Hale looked out into the vast expanse of space. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But the tide had turned, and humanity would never bow again.